Good morning. This is a table of 10-year government bond rates. It's the annual cost of borrowing for these governments for 10 years. The United States pays an average of 4.28% interest per year to borrow money for 10 years. For China, borrowing money for 10 years costs its government just 1.7% per year. Borrowing rates in China are falling across its entire yield curve. The 2, the 10, and the 30-year bond rates are declining steeply. This means that China's government can access capital markets at less than half the cost that the United States government can. The economy here is very strong, with China's exports rising much faster than experts predicted. All this while inflation at the household and producer levels doesn't exist. Prices are falling economy-wide as factory and supply chain productivities increase. The lower cost of capital in China has important knock-on effects. This is a report on China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this analysis is quite critical, actually, of China's investments in developing economies. But they point out that China's overseas lending carries a weighted average interest rate of 4.2%. Said another way, governments in Africa and South America can borrow US dollars from banks in China at a lower interest rate than the United States government can borrow US dollars. That isn't supposed to happen, obviously, and it's the result of a perfect storm where everything is coming together for them while everything is falling apart for us at the same time. When the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, took the job, he was already concerned about the interest rate problem and how that needs to inform how the U.S. government borrows money. Treasury needs interest rates to come down before borrowing more money at longer maturities. In other words, it's getting too expensive for the U.S. government to issue debt at 10 years or longer, so they're instead planning to borrow at much shorter maturities by selling short-term bonds, T-bills, that need to be rolled over more often than once per year. President Trump agrees that until the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates and makes it less expensive to borrow for longer, then they will be borrowing much more short-term. There are some big problems with that strategy, though. First, the amount of new borrowing is just too high. The U.S. government needs to borrow $2 trillion a year. So investors are demanding higher yields anyway, no matter what the Fed does. Inflation is still running hot. Tariffs are a serious problem that are now hitting producer prices. And there is no end to these deficits, which just run higher and higher. Borrowing rates for consumers and businesses reflect all those problems. The second problem is here. The Federal Reserve can cut rates, but the Fed doesn't move the needle much for households and small businesses, or for governments who want to borrow for longer than 10 years. That's because when the Fed announces a rate cut, it's referring to the rate the banks use to lend to each other, which is usually overnight. It has no effect on mortgages or on interest rates on the 10-year Treasury bonds, which are highly correlated. Mortgage rates track very closely with 10-year bond rates because banks need to borrow money long-term in order to lend long-term. The difference there between the blue line and the black shows the spread between government 10-year rates and 30-year mortgage rates. They move together. So when Jerome Powell loses his job and the new guy cuts interest rates 5 minutes later, it isn't going to matter very much to home buyers, for example. The Fed did cut rates 3 times recently, and mortgage rates didn't move. Mortgage rates stayed high because the 10-year bond yield stayed high. The reason for those high rates, these high borrowing costs for the Treasury Department, for businesses, for households, is that the country's financial position now is terrible, and these problems are structural and deep. Over the next year, the next 4 quarters, $9.2 trillion need to be refinanced. That is existing debt, which needs to be rolled over. So most of that debt was taken on when interest rates were a lot lower. So rolling over that 9 trillion is going to cost much more in interest payments than they were when first issued. In addition, there's another $1.9 trillion in new borrowings. So that's a total of over $10 trillion for the next year. So this total debt line is getting steeper and is now at the highest level in history compared to the size of the economy. It costs the United States less, relatively, to fight World War II and then rebuild the economies of Western Europe than it does today just to keep the lights on in Washington. A large driver of that going forward is high levels of new debt issuance at higher interest rates to refinance previous debt. That adds up to lots of problems. There isn't enough money sitting around across the entire Milky Way to keep this going on for much longer. The capacity of global capital markets to absorb all this new debt is pushing borrowing costs up, not just for the US government, but for everyone else. So investors are watching very closely for signs that things are about to go off the rails. In particular, it's these two things, and these are also closely correlated. Treasury bond auctions and how well those go, and how much appetite we see from investors across the world to buy more US Treasury debt. We did a video last year that as the Chinese recycle their trade surpluses into things besides US Treasury bonds, it's an ugly scene. Chinese financial regulators are buying a lot of gold, and they're also bringing back a lot of the dollars they earn abroad and parking them in their own banks and financing, for example, Belt and Road projects in friendly countries. But besides not buying new US debt, the Chinese are net sellers of the US government bonds they've already got. Beijing's holdings of treasuries today are the lowest in over 16 years. So the Chinese are not showing up for Scott Bessent's treasury auctions, and now they have company. Over just this past week, we had 3 days in a row that go to answer this question here. How are those debt auctions going, and how many foreigners are showing up to them? Wednesday, 6 August, an auction of 3-year debt with the worst foreign demand since 2023. Tailing means that the yields were rising throughout the auction. As this bond sale dragged on, the new buyers demanded higher yields compared to the first lenders earlier in the day. Indirects is foreign governments and major foreign institutions. They were the lowest since December 2023. Buy-side demand from foreigners is surprisingly weak. The next day, 7 August, $42 billion in 10-year paper. Very ugly this time. Another tailing auction, and another auction with falling foreign demand. And it was surprising again. Day after that, 8 August. Very ugly again on this sale of $25 billion worth of 30-year bonds, which was probably the worst auction of all. Foreign buying interest was the second lowest in 5 years. That auction Friday was so bad that rates went up along the whole yield curve. That's a misprint. That should read 10-year yield, not 10%. The credit market, they're saying that when the Fed does cut rates, the market believes that inflation is going to shoot up, along with borrowing costs for anyone buying a house or a car. The yield curve will get steeper. Very low rates overnight, and for the maturities out just a few months, which may help Bessent and Trump with the borrowing costs, at least for a while. But for everyone else, borrowing rates and costs are going a lot higher. There is absolutely no good news here for the US government or for American companies or for American families. This data point is shocking. It's almost impossible to believe. An African government can borrow US dollars for a lower rate of interest from a Chinese bank to build a railroad than an American government doing the same thing, and a lot less than an American family trying to buy a house. China and the BRICS countries have built a new financial system. Their governments, their companies, and their families They can borrow money for less than half what we can. Access to low-cost capital is what drives everything else. Consumer spending, household formation, company investment in research and development, government infrastructure. We don't have that access anymore. This is Hong Kong. Be good. Good morning.